At my father's funeral, a woman stood up and said, I was his wife too. Everyone was stunned, including me. Confused, I confronted her after the service. She handed me a photo album and whispered, you need to see who your real father is. I thought I knew everything about my father. He was the kind of man who filled a room with his presence, warm, disciplined, and always had a story to tell. To me, he was more than just a dad. He was a pillar, the person whose footsteps I'd been trying to follow for years. The day of his funeral felt surreal. The small church in Charleston, South Carolina, was packed with friends, family, and colleagues. People were sharing fond memories, stories filled with laughter, and the occasional tear. I was sitting in the front row next to my mother, holding her hand tightly, trying to be the strong one. Then it happened. Just as the pastor was wrapping up the eulogy, a woman in her late 50s stood up from the middle row. She was wearing a dark blue dress, simple but elegant, and her face held an expression that was neither grief-stricken nor calm. It was something else, determination mixed with sadness. She cleared her throat, and in a steady voice, she said, I was his wife too. The room went silent. You could hear the faint hum of the air conditioner, the distant call of a bird outside, and the quiet gasp from my mother. I froze, trying to process what I'd just heard. My father? Her husband? My mother's grip on my hand tightened, her knuckles white. I looked around. Some people turned to stare at the woman, others at us, waiting to see what we'd do. The pastor, clearly blindsided, awkwardly tried to regain control of the service, but the damage was done. After the service, I found her outside near the parking lot, standing by an old green sedan. She didn't look like someone who had just crashed a funeral. There was no smugness, no drama, just a quiet, heavy sadness. I walked up to her, my heart pounding. What did you mean in there? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small, worn photo album. Handing it to me, she leaned in slightly and whispered, you need to see who your real father is. I didn't open it right away. I just stared at it, then back at her. His name was Daniel to me, she added softly. We were married for 20 years. I couldn't breathe for a second. Daniel was my father's name. But married for 20 years? How? My parents had been married for 35 years. The math didn't make sense, or maybe it did, and I just didn't want it to. She got into her car and drove off, leaving me standing there with that photo album clutched in my hands. When I finally opened it, sitting alone in my car, my world shifted. The first picture was of my father, laughing, holding a baby in his arms. Not me. Not my siblings. A baby I'd never seen before. The background was different too, not our house. The woman from the funeral was next to him, her hand on his shoulder, looking at him the way my mother used to. Page after page, there were photos of family vacations, birthdays, Christmas mornings, all with my father front and center, living an entire life I knew nothing about. There was a photo of him teaching a young boy how to ride a bike. Another of him at what looked like a high school graduation, his arm proudly around a teenager who wasn't me. I sat there for hours, flipping through the album over and over, as if the pictures would change if I stared long enough. When I finally went home, I didn't say anything to my mother right away. She was sitting in the kitchen, staring at her coffee, the same cup she'd been holding that morning. I placed the album on the table in front of her. She didn't open it. She just looked at the cover, then at me. I met her after he died, she whispered, her voice hollow. I had no idea. That's when I realized, she wasn't lying. She genuinely didn't know. The days that followed were a blur. I tried to find answers. I went through my father's belongings, searching for anything that could explain how he managed to live two lives. There were receipts from places he'd never mentioned, keys to an apartment I'd never seen, and letters tucked away in an old box. Letters from her. Letters filled with words of love, plans, and updates about their children. I met her again a week later. We sat at a small cafe downtown. She told me everything, how they met at a conference in Atlanta, how he'd said he was separated, how their relationship grew over the years. She never knew about us. She thought my mother was the other woman. And here I was, stuck between two versions of the man I thought I knew. The hardest part wasn't just the betrayal, it was realizing how little I truly knew about my own father. How do you reconcile the loving dad who tucked you in at night with the man who led a double life? I don't have an answer yet. Maybe I never will. But that photo album? I still have it. Sometimes, I flip through it, trying to see the man in those pictures as the same man who taught me how to ride a bike, who cheered at my graduation, who called me champ. And every time, I feel like I'm looking at a stranger. After meeting her, Margaret, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more. Something about the way she'd said, "You need to see who your real father is," kept echoing in my mind. It wasn't just about the photos. It felt like a riddle I hadn't solved yet. A few days later, I decided to visit the apartment my father had apparently been renting. The keys I'd found in his drawer had an address scribbled on an old business card. It was about 40 minutes outside of Charleston, tucked in a quiet suburban neighborhood I'd never been to. The apartment was small, nothing like the house I grew up in. Inside, it felt like time had stopped. His scent lingered faintly, aftershave and old books. There were framed pictures on the walls, none of them with my family. Just Margaret and her 2 kids, a boy and a girl, both grown now. But what caught my eye wasn't the photos. It was a locked drawer in the old wooden desk by the window. I didn't have the key, but frustration can be a strong motivator. I found a letter opener and managed to pry it open. Inside were documents, some old, some recent. Bank statements, letters, even a second phone hidden under a stack of papers. The phone still had some battery left. I scrolled through the messages, my hands shaking. There were texts from Margaret, sure. But there was someone else too. A name I didn't recognize, L. Dawson. Curiosity got the better of me. I called the number. It rang twice before a woman answered, her voice sharp and cautious. "Hello." I hesitated. I'm calling about Daniel. Daniel Carter." Silence. Then, "Who is this?" "I'm his son." Another pause. Then she whispered, almost like she was talking to herself, "He had a son." We agreed to meet the next day at a diner halfway between us. When I got there, she was already seated, a woman in her early 40s, with dark hair pulled back, her eyes guarded but curious. Her name was Lisa Dawson. She wasn't a secret wife. She wasn't even a girlfriend. She was something different. She leaned forward, her voice low. "I was his business partner." "But that's not why you're here, is it?" I shook my head. "I found your number in his phone. I need to know what you know." She sighed, staring into her coffee. "Your father wasn't the man you thought he was. He had other commitments. Financial ones." "What does that mean?" She pulled out a folder from her bag and slid it across the table. Inside were documents, contracts, signed checks, property deeds. But here's the twist, there were properties listed under my name. My name. "I don't understand," I muttered, flipping through the papers. He was moving assets under different names. "Yours included," Lisa said. "I think he was hiding money. Maybe even from people you don't want to owe." My mind raced. This wasn't just about an affair anymore. This was something deeper. I went back to my mother's house, sat her down, and showed her the documents. She stared at them, her face pale. "Did you know about this?" I asked. She shook her head slowly. "No, but there's something I never told you." And just like that, another secret surfaced. Turns out, years ago, my father had gone through some financial trouble, but he'd brushed it off as bad investments. My mother never questioned it because the bills were always paid, the lights stayed on, and life carried on. But now, looking at those documents, it was clear, he wasn't just a man with 2 families. He was a man with 2 lives. I decided to dig deeper. I met with Lisa again, asked more questions, followed leads. One of the addresses listed on the deeds led me to an old storage unit on the outskirts of town. Inside, I found boxes, filled with old letters, passports, IDs with different names. But the thing that froze me in place was a stack of photographs. Not of family. Not of friends. Surveillance photos. Of me. Me at college. Me at my job. Even one from a few weeks before he died. Why? I couldn't sleep for days after that. Every shadow felt heavier, every sound outside my window made me jump. I didn't know if I was being paranoid or if someone was actually watching me. I went back to Lisa, slammed the photos on the table. "What is this? Why was my father keeping tabs on me?" She looked at the photos, her face pale. "I don't know. I swear, I didn't know about this." But I could see the doubt in her eyes. She knew something. The deeper I dug, the darker it got. Margaret's son, his son, reached out to me after hearing I'd been asking questions. We met at a park, both of us tense, strangers connected by blood but nothing else. "He wasn't who you thought he was," he said quietly. I laughed bitterly. Yeah, I'm starting to get that. Then he dropped a bombshell. He told me about you once, he said. Said you were the one who'd inherit everything. But not because you deserved it. Because you were part of the plan. The plan? I asked him what he meant, but he shook his head. I don't know. That's all he said. Just that you were important. Now I can't stop wondering, what plan? Why me? What was my father hiding, and how far does it go? I thought this was just a story about betrayal. About a man who lived a double life. But it's not. It's about a man I never really knew, and the legacy he left behind that I'm still trying to understand. And the worst part? After that meeting with Margaret's son, my head was spinning. The plan. What did that even mean? It sounded like something out of a movie, but this was real life, my life, and I was in the middle of something I didn't understand. For weeks, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those photos, pictures of me, taken without my knowledge, tucked away in a storage unit like I was some kind of project. My father had been watching me, not as a proud dad, but like I was part of something. I decided I needed answers, once and for all. I went back to Lisa. This time, I wasn't polite. I slammed my hands on the table and demanded the truth. She flinched, then sighed, her shoulders dropping. All right, she whispered. You want the truth? Fine. And that's when it all came out. My father hadn't just been juggling two families. He'd been involved in some shady business deals. Not illegal, exactly, but morally gray, skimming money, hiding assets, using fake names to move property around. He'd been working with investors, promising them returns that never came, shifting money from one project to the next like a house of cards. And here's where it gets worse, he'd put my name on some of those deals to cover his tracks. If things went south, guess who'd be left holding the bag? Me. Lisa handed me a folder filled with more documents. Your father planned everything, she said quietly. He thought if something happened to him, no one would suspect his own son. You'd be the perfect cover. I felt sick. My father hadn't just betrayed my mother, Margaret, or even his business partners. He betrayed me. I spent the next few days thinking about what to do. I could walk away, pretend I never found out, let it all disappear with him. But every time I thought about how he'd used me, how he'd played all of us like pieces on a chessboard, something in me snapped. I wanted revenge. Not petty revenge. Real revenge. The kind that would tear down the perfect image he'd built and make sure he was remembered for who he really was. So, I made a plan. I gathered everything, every document, every photo, every fake ID, every bank statement. I met with Margaret and her kids, showed them the truth. They were furious, especially her son, who realized our father had promised him things he never intended to give. Then I went to the authorities. I thought about going to the police, but this wasn't just about crimes. It was about exposing him for the fraud he'd been, in every part of his life. So, I went to the press. I contacted a journalist who specialized in uncovering financial scandals. I gave her everything, documents, photos, even the recordings I'd made of Lisa explaining his schemes. She was like a shark smelling blood in the water. When the story broke, it was everywhere. Beloved businessman Daniel Carter exposed, double life, hidden families, and financial deception. The fallout was immediate. His business partners turned on him, even from beyond the grave, he'd burned bridges. Companies he'd worked with scrambled to distance themselves. Lawsuits piled up against his estate. His so-called legacy crumbled overnight. But the most satisfying part? The family he tried to keep separate, me, my mother, Margaret, and her kids, we stood united. We weren't going to let his lies define us. We sold everything he'd owned. Every property, every asset. The money? We donated it to charities he'd always pretended to support but never actually cared about. It wasn't about the money. It was about erasing the illusion he'd worked so hard to create. His name, once respected, was now a cautionary tale. And me? I finally stopped being his son. I became my own person. That was the real revenge.